Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 6 audio lecture for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College. As you can see on the schedule, we will begin a new essay this week, the Compare and Contrast essay. So, like the previous two essay units, I'll take a few minutes, read the assignment prompt, expound upon that a little bit, and then in the second half of today's audio lecture, I will discuss this week's reading assignment, the Ellen Laird piece on teaching and educating people online. So let's start with the compare and contrast essay prompt. This is in the compare and contrast module, which is now visible and available in the content tab. And like the previous two essay units, it should be the first thing you see in the compare and contrast module. So follow along with me. I may pause periodically, but I want to read most, if not all, of this prompt to you. For this essay, you will compare and contrast two subjects within a broad topic. For example, consider this topic: which running shoe brand is the best, Nike or Puma? As you can see, this question implies that one of these two running shoe brands may increase one's ability to run faster, perhaps more efficiently, etc. Having such an implication is one of the requirements for this assignment, so be sensitive to that. When searching for your essay's implications, be specific. Notice I do not simply ask which shoe is the best, I ask which running shoe is the best. I also narrow my focus by comparing and contrasting two brands, Nike and Puma, instead of 4 or 5. Here are other questions you can and should ask yourself while writing this essay. These questions should not appear in the essay itself. So I want to pause there for just a moment. So compare and contrast as a model or pattern of development. Many of my students say they enjoy it, and they even find it a bit easier than the previous essay, the definition essay. And it's not because we don't inherently do the work of defining and classifying things in our day-to-day lives. I think we're simply less aware of that. I think we often do the work of utilizing definition patterns without actually realizing that's what we do. By contrast, I think compare and contrast is something we also do quite often in our day-to-day lives, but I think we're often incredibly aware when we do that, and I think we understand. I think there's something almost intuitive about compare and contrast in relation to something like definition. So the first thing that I wanted to just say was, if you had any difficulty, or if you found using a definition pattern a bit frustrating and perhaps even unclear, I think you might enjoy the compare and contrast essay more because, again, compare and contrast as a pattern I think is far more intuitive than, for example, definition. However, with that said, one of the potential challenges of a compare and contrast essay is just how much more there is for you to do and consider. What I mean by that is, with the first two essays, what I've asked you to do to explore the composition work you've completed, it's been smaller, perhaps more contained, focused on one particular idea or concept. Here, with a compare and contrast, because you are comparing and contrasting, you're now mixing or incorporating multiple subjects into your essay. And this is something that I did for a reason, because as we progress throughout the semester, the level of complexity, the number of things you will need to consider, the number of things you will need to reckon with, that will increase. And the culmination, I suppose, is with the research essay, which is perhaps the most conceptually ambitious thing we will do this semester. So keep that, or think about that as well. Have that in your mind, that the work that I want you to do for this particular essay is more conceptually ambitious. There's more for you to do here. I think that's important for everyone to remember. I also wanted to say something about this word I use in this particular paragraph or section, implication or implications. What I mean when I use a word like this, let me start with perhaps what I think you should not do. So you can, in theory, compare and contrast almost anything, but I want you to think carefully about your topic. I want you to think carefully about the subjects you choose to compare and contrast as well. And I also want you to think seriously about, well, what is the point or what is the purpose? What sorts of assumptions have I brought to this compare and contrast pattern that perhaps I am unaware of, that I want to potentially clarify or become aware of? And that's also work you can do before you, I suppose, even decide which subjects you will choose to compare and contrast. The thing that I want you to avoid is to simply do the work of comparing and contrasting multiple subjects without having some idea or some sense of why you're doing that work. Because unlike videos you might see on the internet where it's obvious the person who created this content is doing compare and contrast work, it seems as if they don't have a larger point. They don't have a thesis statement. And we can see this. I think they often reveal this when at the end of the video, they may say something like, I want to know what you think. You choose, you decide. That's something I don't want to see in this essay because, again, I want there to be a reason for this essay to exist. I want this compare and contrast model that you utilize for this particular essay to drive toward a larger idea, which, again, will be your thesis statement. So I suppose when I use a word like implication or implications, what you should perhaps think, what you should maybe hear is purpose. There needs to be a purpose for everything that I do in this essay. What is that purpose? Or if there are perhaps multiple purposes, what are those? So from here, I'll continue reading the assignment prompt. And I left with some other questions you can and should consider. But as I say on the prompt, don't think you actively need to incorporate these questions into your essay. These are simply questions you can and should think about as you are developing this essay, brainstorming possible topics, etc. What will my reader learn after reading this essay? How can a reader apply this information to enrich their lives? Why does this matter? Am I generalizing? If so, how can I remedy, which is to say fix that problem? For this essay, do not do any outside research. Instead, I want you to use personal experience as a means of making an analytical argument that is persuasive and well crafted. As always, even though personal experience has certain limitations, your personal experiences make you an authority, so use the resources of personal experience to inform, influence, and guide your essay. So here, I'll pause for just a moment. When I say I do not want you to do or conduct any outside research, what I mean is you'll have an opportunity to write a research essay next. So please don't think that you need to compile this thorough works cited page. With that said, if you, for example, let us use the example that I use on this prompt, you compare and contrast two different running shoes, and maybe one of the points you want to make while writing this essay is price matters, price is important, and you need or want to Google just to confirm the prices of perhaps two different running shoes, that's completely acceptable. I would not consider or constitute that as research, so please have that distinction or that differentiation in mind when you're envisioning or imagining what research means in this course. If you need to do a bit of light Googling just to confirm proprietary information about a particular consumer good, completely acceptable. I would argue it starts to become research when you are actively finding perhaps secondary sources that you want to quote directly to support and better develop a larger point you want to make. Again, you'll have an opportunity to do that in the research essay itself. And finally, within this essay, I want you to address and argue against one potential counter argument. We will discuss this in more detail later. The minimum word count requirement is 900 words. Of course, adhere to MLA documentation standards outlined on the syllabus. You will submit this essay through D2L by midnight or 11:59 p.m. on the day that it is due. So I will probably say something next week about the counter-argumentative strategy, so look for that. Then, like the previous two essays, a shorter, more modest essay at 900 words. But I wanted to say a few additional things about compare and contrast and how you can and should think about compare and contrast as a pattern of development. So, the first thing, you've heard me maybe use this language a couple of times in this week's lecture: topic, subjects, points. So, I would encourage you, if you haven't, leave the prompt for a moment and find and open the document right below it, the outlining document for compare and contrast essays, because when I use a word like topic, if you think about the example from the assignment prompt, the topic for that particular essay might be running shoe brands. From there, I have elected to compare and contrast two subjects, which is to say, two distinct things: Nike tennis shoes, Puma tennis shoes. From there, I may have a multitude of points that I want to use as a means of comparing and contrasting those two subjects. It could be price or cost, it could be durability, it could be efficiency, which is to say, which running shoe will allow me to run with maybe a reduced injury risk or whatever, so on and so forth. All of those things, I would strongly encourage you before you begin writing this essay, simply try to have an understanding of what each and every one of those are for your essay. What is your topic? What are the two? And as the prompt indicates, I would encourage you not to work beyond two subjects, because a compare and contrast essay, what's really interesting about compare and contrast as a pattern of development is how it can just scale endlessly, it seems. But it's important when writing and when using a compare and contrast pattern to always think about how you scale that essay in relation to the expectations for the assignment, which is to say, if you are tasked with writing a 900 or 1,000 word essay like the one I want you to write, more than two subjects might cause your essay to not have the level of detail that I want, or the level of detail that is perhaps necessary for you to effectively execute your thesis. Conversely, if you were writing a 10, 20,000 word essay and you chose to compare and contrast only two or three subjects, there may simply not be enough for you to say. You may need to scale, which is to say, to include and incorporate more subjects to accommodate the length and size, the scope of that particular assignment. So for this essay, because it is a modest 900 word essay at minimum, choose no more than two subjects. If it's more than that, I think that's probably more than this essay warrants, and I don't think you'll have an opportunity to say as much as you want and need to say to effectively support a thesis statement. But if you look at this outlining document, you'll see, broadly speaking, there are two ways to approach or imagine an outlining strategy for a compare and contrast essay. And here, everything I'm saying, I want you to imagine I'm excluding the introduction and the conclusion. This is just the body paragraphs. There's this point-by-point strategy and the subject-by-subject strategy. Each one has its benefits and limitations. What you see with, for example, the point-by-point, your body paragraphs, you would organize or divide your body paragraphs by the different points you want to explore. So, for example, if we think about something like running shoes and running shoe brands, perhaps one of the points that you want to make, or one of the points, that is to say, that you want to explore, is cost. Well, in a paragraph where you, and this is again using the point-by-point strategy, you would explore cost and the implications of different costs regarding running shoe brands in that one paragraph. So you would keep both of those subjects together in that particular paragraph. Then when it's time for you to perhaps transition to a different point, perhaps something like durability, you would follow that same pattern. You would, again, address and explore both subjects in that same paragraph about durability. So with the point-by-point method, what my students typically find is it feels more argumentative, almost more combative, because you actively include both subjects in each body paragraph. Now, by contrast, there is this subject-by-subject method. And you can almost imagine with the subject-by-subject method, you are, and again, just body paragraphs, you are dividing your essay almost into two sections. You can imagine, again, independent of the introduction or conclusion. The body of your essay is really in two parts. There's the first part where you may address the first subject and all of the relevant and necessary points that you choose to explore. You would then do the exact same thing in a separate paragraph or set of paragraphs with your second subject. Now, one of the potential limitations of this subject by subject method is it often feels less argumentative, maybe less combative, but one of its benefits is that it's far easier to organize. When I have students write a compare and contrast essay using this subject by subject model, what they often say is, sure, it's less combative, it's less argumentative, but it was so much easier for me to envision and imagine organizing this essay. I knew, for example, that all I needed to do in the first section after the introduction was explore that first subject. And then I could just seamlessly transition to the next subject. So again, like with the point by point method, there are distinct benefits and limitations. You do not need to identify at any point. That should be clear to me. If it's not, that might be an indication that there's a problem with your essay. You do not need to indicate or declare which outlining strategy you chose, but I want you to think carefully and seriously about how you want to write this essay, which feels better to you. A point-by-point strategy, a subject-by-subject strategy. What you'll see with most of the reading that I want you to do is those writers have a tendency to blend both of those two outlining options, but for all of you, especially for those of you potentially writing a compare and contrast essay for the first time, choose one of these two outlining strategies, broadly speaking, which is to say, broadly speaking, more often than not, for my essay, I will choose or I will write using this point-by-point strategy, or I will choose or I will write using this subject-by-subject strategy. Again, on the prompt, there is language about this counter-argumentative strategy. I'll speak about that, I think, next week, because for time purposes, I want to have a sufficient amount of time to discuss the reading for today. So I think that's everything I wanted to say about the essay prompt, what it means to write a compare and contrast essay. Okay, let us transition to the reading for this week, the Ellen Laird piece. So the thing I like so much about this Ellen Laird piece is how relevant, I suppose, it still seems. Now, Laird wrote this in the early, I believe, 21st century. So it is, at this point, a couple of decades old. But like the Megan Down piece from the definition essay, one of the reasons why I like to continue to teach it is because I think Laird offers some observations and insights about online education that even as platforms become less frustrating and cumbersome to use, she offers these observations that remain still quite relevant. So I think we could almost imagine, much like Megan Down in her piece on fame, Laird both assesses and critiques a particular problem or set of problems that existed while she wrote the essay. She's also, however, I think, looking forward for us, reading it now some 2-3 decades after she wrote it. So there's something about this essay that feels as if it's critiquing something that happened in a particular moment, but I think for us, it also feels predictive in some way. I also think the way Laird both imagines and delivers her thesis is quite useful, and I think this is something that will be particularly useful for all of you, because one way to imagine developing a thesis statement or executing a thesis statement for a compare and contrast essay is to imagine, well, A is better than B for these reasons. Nike running shoes are better than Puma running shoes for these reasons. And that's certainly an acceptable way to imagine a thesis statement for a compare and contrast essay. But Laird utilizes something similar to a while, however framework. So for her, the thesis of this essay is not traditional education is better than online education for these reasons. Instead, it's while many people might think online education and traditional education are the same, they are, however, distinctly different. And here are the reasons why those differences matter, or here are the reasons why those differences might exist. And I think connected to or as an extension of this thesis, is an interesting exploration of how the internet and social interactions online change and perhaps even distort the way we think about other people. I think that's an essential component to this essay and the thesis statement she wants to deliver here. But the way she begins and ends, I think, is really quite unique because this is, in many ways, a traditional introduction, and you could almost imagine the first couple of paragraphs function as the introduction for this essay. But she has this conceit, and you may have noticed how often she uses romantic and erotic language in the opening paragraph. And here, I'll read directly from the piece, quote, "The honeymoon is over. My romance with distance teaching is losing its spark. Gone are the days when I looked forward to each new online encounter with students, when preparing and posting a basic assignment was a thrilling adventure, when my colleagues and friends were well-wishers, cautiously hopeful about my new entanglement. What remains is this instructor alone, often in the dark of night, facing the reality of my online class and struggling to make it work." So one of the questions I would ask you to think about is, well, why would she frame this entanglement with online education in romantic ways? Why use all of this romantic terminology? What is the point she wants to make here? And I suppose for anyone who is in love, has been in love, if you know these feelings, I think you might sense and perhaps understand why this is such an applicable framing device. When you first begin a romantic entanglement with someone, I think there's this tendency to not see, for obvious and sympathetic reasons, or conveniently ignore and compartmentalize obvious problems or red flags. And after, a couple of months, maybe a couple of weeks, depending on how things go, all of those problems, it's not like, and I think this is what's important, it's not like these problems manifest themselves. It's as if you're seeing what was there the entire time. And so in that way, it's not so much the person, the object of your affection changes, which is not to say that people don't change, because I think they do. But I think with this particular situation, it's not like the person changes, it's really you change. And you can almost imagine the filter that you might use to see and understand this person, that's what changes. And for someone like Laird, because again, it's not like online education drastically and suddenly changed. As I just said a moment ago, what changed was the particular lens or filter by which she viewed and understood online education. So because of that, I think this is such an appropriate way of framing this relationship or entanglement with this new way of teaching. It's a lot like falling in love with someone, or it's a lot like being excited about a new romantic relationship. And again, it's not like sustaining those initial feelings is possible, or perhaps even something anyone would want. It's not something maybe one would want to encourage if you have or are currently in a long sustained relationship. The way you think about your partner obviously shifts and changes, and there's a reason why, if for no other reason then it can feel a bit exhausting, there's a reason why those initial excited feelings are so wonderful, but sustaining that level of engagement, sustaining those feelings, is nearly impossible. So the point, I suppose, is not, well, once those feelings evaporate, I suppose the relationship needs to end. No, not at all. And I think Laird gestures towards that near the end. It's not like her point at the end is, and so I will never teach online courses again. Instead, this is an essay that invites readers to think seriously about perhaps some of the messaging and rhetoric they've received about online education, and how it's exactly like being a traditional student who has the opportunity and the luxury and the privilege to go to class several times a week. Maybe if you have a job, it's a part-time job. I think, again, this essay is far more interested in disabusing the reader of those sorts of notions. What I also think is useful about this essay and really interesting, and again, I think this is one of those points or one of those areas where the essay at times moves beyond this simple and contained argument about education and actually has something quite bigger and more interesting to say about how we behave and how we interact with people online. And even though Laird may gallivant off onto these conversations about, well, how do we think about people when we primarily and principally engage with them online, that doesn't mean this essay has all of these tangential moments that detract from her overall point. All of it is connected to this larger point she wants to make about online education. What I also think is really great about this essay, and this is one of the more subtle parts or aspects of it, is how Laird so effectively shifts and transitions from not just one paragraph to the next, but one point to the next. This is an essential component of any well-written compare and contrast essay, knowing how to shift or transition from one point to the next, one paragraph to the next. And I would just bring to your attention the final 2 or 3 paragraphs. Here, Laird writes, I am not on your buddy list. The egalitarian atmosphere of the internet chat room transfers rapidly and appropriately to the online classroom. Faceless and ageless online, I am at first addressed as a peer. If students knew that I dress like many of their mothers, or that my hair will soon be more gray than brown, would their exchanges with me be different? I reveal what I want them to know: the date of my marathon, my now deceased dog's consumption of a roll of aluminum foil, my 1 gig as a cocktail lounge pianist, but little of what one good look at me in my jumper and jewelry would tell them. They, on the other hand, hold nothing back. Confessional writing, always a challenge in composition, can easily become the norm online. So can racist, sexist, and otherwise offensive remarks, even admissions of crimes. The lack of a face-to-face match with a rhetorical voice provides the illusion of anonymity and thus the potential for a no-holds-barred quality to every discussion thread. The usual restraint characterizing conversations among classroom acquaintances evaporates online within about 2 weeks. Private conversations fuse with academic discussion before an instructor can log in. So, a couple of things here. First, a moment ago, I mentioned the importance of effectively transitioning from one point to the next, one paragraph to the next. I want you to notice how Laird does this. And again, it's something that good writers often do in such a subtle way. You almost need to pause and look for it to really see it. It's this phrase, on the other hand. It's the beginning of the penultimate paragraph. They, on the other hand, hold nothing back. I want you to pause and really think about how that language, on the other hand, helps to connect the previous paragraph with that paragraph. And you'll often notice a lot of these transitional words or phrases. You may often see them at the beginning of new paragraphs. A lot of them are just simple conjunctions or conjunctive phrases. A well-placed conjunction, especially in a compare and contrast essay, can do all the work in helping you maintain a particular pace and tempo while simultaneously connecting subsequent points to previous points. But another reason why I like these 2 paragraphs is because it speaks to something I spoke about earlier, how the primary difference, or perhaps for someone like Laird, one of the primary differences between online education and traditional education is how online identities are often these consistent things. We don't see when, for example, we look at someone's profile picture, all of the subtleties and all of the nuances, the idiosyncrasies that might tell us, for example, that someone has had a bad day or that someone is quite tired and taxed. We always look the same. And I think that has an interesting psychological effect on people. And I think Laird gestures towards that here if you were interacting with a person IRL, there are things you probably wouldn't say to them based on a variety of different factors. One of them might quite simply be just seeing how someone responds might cause you to change or modify what you say, your response to them, etc. But without those mechanisms, I think people are understandably encouraged to say whatever they want. And I suppose all of us probably have just a laundry list of examples of this, times when someone who said something online that they would never actually say if the two of you were in person together at a restaurant, at one another's house, whatever. And I think here, again, Laird, she writes about this in 2003. And I would just encourage all of you to think about the predictive power and potential of these sorts of moments. How several decades after Laird writes this, or excuse me, several decades after Laird wrote this, we're very much having the same sorts of conversations about how internet anonymity is potentially more of a problem than anything else. And again, I said as much when I discussed the Megan Down piece on Fame. I'm far from a Luddite. I think the internet has created so many fantastic opportunities. But as Laird, I think, so succinctly indicates in her conclusion, there are also consequences. And I think, again, like Megan Down, she simultaneously assesses, analyzes something she saw as she wrote this essay, while also predicting potential problems that might continue or even become far worse with the advent of technology that she certainly was not aware of, whether it's social media, the way apps instead of web browsers constitute most, if not all, internet activity. It's really fascinating. So I think that's all I wanted to say about the Laird piece, because again, I want to keep things here relatively short and easily digestible. I would also just encourage you, the final thing I'll say is to notice how, and I spoke about this when I spoke about the prompt, this idea that there needs to be an implication or a set of implications, which for you might operate, or that language might represent, well, what is the point of all of this? What is guiding your compare and contrast work to ensure that you are not just clumsily comparing and contrasting two different subjects because it's the first thing you thought of? All of the points Laird addresses in this essay are relevant to the things that I have spoken about today. This idea that traditional education and online education are two fundamentally different modalities that have a whole host of challenges, many of which some, it seems, are unwilling to acknowledge, address, reckon with, but also the way that the internet just as a space has consumed education as a space. And again, I think this is one of the more interesting points that Laird makes, that depending on where you are in the world, if it's not an internet space, there's a whole host of different assumptions, approaches, ways of behaving that you might inherently understand. For example, the way you might speak when you're at a friend's house for a party is probably not how you would speak if you were at a religious ceremony in a religious institution. And it's fascinating how we just inherently know that we need to shift and change our behavior based on where we are. But for someone like Laird, and again, I think she's really quite smart about this, the internet just has the effect of flattening all of that. All spaces online, it seems, just become the same space. And here, I think Laird's point is educational spaces, in some respects, cannot just continue to operate as educational spaces in the way we know and understand it when, for example, we go to class on campus. The sensibilities of the internet consumes and cannibalizes those spaces. So much so that everything just starts to feel like an internet space when you're online. There's no real difference. There's no way to differentiate. And I would just encourage you to think about whether or not you agree. Do you think that most, if not all, spaces online just basically start to feel like the same space and there's very little difference, or it's hard to see the differences between, for example, being in a college classroom online to being on your favorite social media site, perusing Reddit, so on and so forth. So, okay, again, I think that's all I wanted to say here. So, for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College, my name is Colin Cox. Have a nice day, and I hope to talk to you soon.